The midwife's hands were slippery with blood as she fought to keep a young girl alive. On the bed before her lay a 13-year-old child, body twisting and breaking under the strain of labor. 4 hours, her screams filled the cold stone walls of Pembroke Castle. Her small frame wasn't built for childbirth, her hips hadn't widened, her body hadn't finished growing. And yet, here she was, fighting to bring a baby into the world. The baby was stuck. The mother was dying. That night in the winter of 1457, everyone in that chamber knew a truth that history later tried to smooth over. Margaret Beaufort should never have been pregnant in the first place. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to uncover the story medieval historians tried to sanitize, the shocking reality of what happened when a 12-year-old girl was forced into marriage with a man twice her age. This isn't just another tale of medieval customs. This is the story of how greed destroyed a child's body, how the powerful looked away, and how that broken little girl somehow grew into one of the most formidable women in Tudor England. Backhand index pointing right before we dive in. If stories like this fascinate you, hidden truths, raw history, the parts textbooks leave out, make sure you hit subscribe and tap the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next deep dive into the forgotten corners of history. Now, let's go back to where it all began. It's May 31st, 1443. A baby girl is born at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. Her name is Margaret. And from the very first breath she takes, she isn't simply a child, she's a prize. Her father, John Beaufort, was the Duke of Somerset, one of England's most powerful nobles. But barely a year later, John was gone, found dead under circumstances so suspicious that whispers of suicide spread like wildfire. In medieval England, suicide wasn't just a sin, it was a stain, a disgrace that tainted an entire bloodline. Suddenly, infant Margaret wasn't just fatherless. She was vulnerable. But here's the catch. This tiny baby had inherited a fortune that made men's mouths water. Lands, titles, wealth. She became prey before she could even walk. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, tried her best to protect her daughter. She kept her close, raised her with her half-siblings, and ensured she had a fine education. Little Margaret learned to read French, studied diligently, and showed an intelligence beyond her years. For a moment, you might almost believe she could have grown up safe. But kings don't care about children's safety. They care about power. When Margaret was just 3, King Henry VI decided her future for her. He handed her over like a gift to William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk. Suffolk saw opportunity and he wasted no time. He married this toddler to his own 7-year-old son John. Yes, you heard that right. A 3-year-old girl was declared someone's bride. Can you imagine it? A child so young she probably couldn't even pronounce the vows of the ceremony. Some records suggest the marriage took place in 1450, others hint at an earlier date. Either way, it needed papal approval because the children were cousins. And the Pope, instead of protecting them, granted it. Even the church was complicit. But fate played its own hand. By 1453, Suffolk was dead, arrested and murdered. His family's fortunes collapsed, and suddenly Margaret was back on the market. This is when the story turns darker. King Henry VI had 2 half-brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. They weren't highborn in the traditional sense. Their father was a Welsh servant who had married Henry's widowed mother. But through royal favor, they'd risen. They were ambitious, shrewd, and they had the king's ear. When Edmund Tudor looked at 12-year-old Margaret, he didn't see a child still clutching dolls. He saw a fortune. He saw land. He saw power. And most disturbingly, he saw her womb. On November 1st, 1455, they were married. Margaret was 12. Edmund was 24. Here's something crucial to understand. Yes, medieval England allowed child marriages. But there was an unspoken boundary. Consummation usually waited until the bride was at least 14, often older. Not because people were kinder back then, but because they knew the risks. They had seen young girls die from pregnancies their bodies couldn't endure. But Edmund Tudor didn't care. Some sources suggest it happened on the very wedding night. Within days, he forced himself on her. And let's be clear, it wasn't consummation. It was sexual assault. Margaret was 12. Too young to consent, too young to understand, too young to survive what was being done to her. As historian Elizabeth Norton bluntly puts it, marrying a child was acceptable at the time, but actually sleeping with her was not. Edmund crossed a line that even his contemporaries recognized as monstrous. What? Money. You see, medieval law was cruelly simple. If an heiress died childless, her lands went back to her family. But if she died after bearing a child, her husband held those lands for life. Edmund looked at his 12-year-old bride and calculated that the sooner she was pregnant, the sooner his fortune was secured, even if it killed her. By April 1456, Margaret was pregnant. Still only 12, she carried a child she never asked for, the result of a union she couldn't refuse. Can you imagine it? At 12, most kids today are navigating middle school. Margaret was battling morning sickness, confusion, and fear. Her belly grew heavy with a child she had no choice in conceiving. And then her nightmare deepened. That July, during the ongoing Wars of the Roses, Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces. They locked him in Carmarthen Castle. By November, on their first wedding anniversary, he was dead. The official story said plague. But whispers suggested otherwise. Now, Margaret was 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, and a widow. She could have stayed at her late husband's estate in Lampay. But Margaret made a choice that showed the steel beginning to form in her character. Despite the dangers, despite her advanced pregnancy, she set out for Pembroke Castle, seeking protection under her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. Picture it, a young girl, her body already pushed to its breaking point, riding through the bitter cold of winter, down rough, war-torn roads, through hostile territory. The journey could have killed her. But she made it. And it was at Pembroke, on January 28, 1457, that her real ordeal began. Labor started. And almost immediately, it became clear something was terribly wrong. Margaret was described by every chronicler as small and slight. Her hips hadn't widened, her body hadn't matured. The baby had nowhere to go. Hour after hour, the screams filled the castle halls. The midwives exchanged panicked glances. They delivered countless babies, but this was different. This wasn't a woman in labor. This was a child being torn apart by something her body was never meant to endure. The details are lost to history, but the aftermath tells the tale. The birth was so violent, so destructive, that Margaret never bore another child. In an era where women routinely had 10 or more children, Margaret Beaufort had only one. Her body was destroyed at 13. The child miraculously survived. His name was Henry, the boy who would one day become Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. But his survival came at a terrible cost, one his mother would carry for the rest of her life. The baby was alive. Margaret had survived. But what happened inside that chamber at Pembroke Castle left scars that never healed. Years later, John Fisher, Margaret's confessor, friend, and later a saint, preached at her funeral. In his sermon, he recalled that moment, describing it as nothing less than a miracle that a child could be born of so little a personage. Even half a century later, he still marveled that Margaret had survived childbirth at all. And while history likes to frame it as divine providence, modern medicine helps us understand the truth. A 13-year-old's pelvis simply isn't developed enough for childbirth. Babies get stuck. Pressure builds. Tissues rip and die. Fistulas form. The kind of injuries Margaret suffered would be considered catastrophic even with today's surgical care. But beyond the physical damage, think about the trauma. 13 years old. Father dead by suicide. Forced into marriage. Assaulted by her husband. Widowed while pregnant. Nearly killed giving birth. All before she even reached her teenage years. Is it any wonder that Margaret's relationship with her son became the central obsession of her life? To her, Henry wasn't just a child. He was her reason for surviving. Some historians even argue her devotion bordered on obsessive, likely a trauma response to the near-death experience that bound their lives together. Margaret's ordeal didn't just shape her relationship with Henry, it shaped the woman she became. She never forgot what had been done to her. She never forgot how it felt to be powerless, treated as property, betrayed by those meant to protect her. And decades later, when she had the chance, she tried to prevent others from suffering the same fate. One story in particular reveals just how deeply the scars of Pembroke haunted her. Years later, when Margaret's own granddaughter, also named Margaret Tudor, was betrothed to the King of Scotland at a very young age, she fought against it. She and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, begged Henry VII not to allow the marriage to proceed so soon. They feared exactly what had happened to Margaret Beaufort, that her granddaughter would be injured, even killed, if the King of Scots refused to wait. Her son himself recorded her words, "The Queen and my mother are very much against this marriage. They fear the King of Scots would not wait but injure her and endanger her health." 50 years after her own trauma, Margaret was still fighting against the same cruelty. She knew what not waiting meant. She had lived it. But even her protests weren't enough. Politics moved forward, and young Margaret Tudor was sent north to Scotland. Just like her grandmother, she was married at 13. The cycle continued. This is what makes Margaret Beaufort's story so much more than a historical tragedy. It wasn't an isolated case. It was a pattern. One so horrific that even in the Middle Ages people knew it was wrong. Yes, child marriage was legal. Yes, contracts were signed. But there were still limits. Noble families often included clauses forbidding consummation until the girl was older. Everyone knew the dangers of pregnancy too young. And yet, when it came to Margaret, those limits were ignored. Edmund Tudor knew exactly what he was doing when he forced a 12-year-old to conceive. The king knew what he was doing when he handed her over. The priests knew what they were blessing when they performed the wedding. They all looked the other way. Because Margaret wasn't a person to them. She was property. And that's the truth at the core of this story. The Tudor dynasty, the dynasty of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, the so-called Golden Age of England, was built on the body of a child who nearly died bringing its founder into the world. But Margaret didn't die. She survived. And survival made her dangerous. After Edmund's death, she remarried twice. Her second marriage to Henry Stafford was, by all accounts, happier and far less traumatic. She began to develop her reputation as a pious, intelligent, and politically shrewd woman. But it was always her son Henry who defined her choices. She fought for him, maneuvered for him, schemed for him. During the Wars of the Roses, when rival houses battled for the throne, Margaret played her cards carefully. She aligned with whoever could protect Henry's claim, even if it meant betraying others. And when Henry finally returned from exile in 1485 to challenge Richard III at Bosworth, Margaret was one of the masterminds behind the scenes. Her network of alliances, her relentless campaigning, her political genius helped put her son on the throne. It's almost poetic. The child who had been treated as property became the king's mother, the woman who built the foundation of Tudor England. But here's what often gets lost when we tell the story of Margaret Beaufort. Success doesn't erase trauma. Power doesn't heal wounds. She may have been the founder of Cambridge colleges, a patron of education, a political powerhouse who signed her name Margaret R. as if she were a queen. But she never had another child. Her body never recovered. And she never escaped the memory of that freezing winter night at Pembroke Castle when she was 13 years old, screaming as her body broke. Even her affection for Edmund, her abusive husband, reveals something complicated. She asked to be buried beside him, not her later, kinder husbands. Some historians suggest this was Stockholm Syndrome before we had a name for it. When you're 12 years old and the entire world tells you this is normal, that this is God's will, what choice do you have but to internalize it? It's one of the most chilling details of her story, that she could grow to accept, even revere, the man who destroyed her childhood. And here's the most important point. Even in the 15th century, people recognized what happened to Margaret as wrong. The average age of consummation was around 14, sometimes later. Many families explicitly delayed it. Edmund Tudor's decision to force his 12-year-old bride was not just cruel, it was shocking even to his peers. But no one stopped him. Because in the end, Margaret's life wasn't hers. It was England's. She was a pawn on the chessboard of power, and her suffering was acceptable collateral in the pursuit of dynasties. Think about this. Every time we talk about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, about Elizabeth I's golden reign, about the splendor of Tudor England, we're talking about a dynasty that began with the screams of a child. Henry VII's throne was bought with Margaret's blood. Elizabeth's crown was born from Margaret's pain. The Tudor rose bloomed in soil watered with the tears of a girl who should have been playing with dolls. She survived, yes. She even thrived. But at what cost? Margaret Beaufort's story isn't just about survival. It's about the price exacted when we treat children as property. It's about the way systems of power chew up the innocent to feed dynasties. And it's about the scars that never fade no matter how much success follows. By the time she died in 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday, Margaret had outlived 4 husbands. She had seen her son crowned king, her grandson inherit the throne, and her family secure its place in history. She was celebrated as pious, brilliant, and formidable. But she was also the girl who never had another child. The girl whose body bore the cost of England's ambition. The girl who had been 12 years old when her fate was sealed. Margaret Beaufort's life is often told as a triumph. A woman who rose above tragedy to become one of the most influential figures in England. A founder of colleges, a matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, a pious and brilliant political strategist. And yes, those things are true. But to stop the story there is to miss the real Margaret. The survivor. The child who was sacrificed so that a dynasty could be born. Because even as she built her power, even as she shaped the course of English history, she never truly escaped Pembroke Castle. It's tempting to look at Margaret and see resilience as proof of healing. After all, she wielded influence in a world that usually silenced women. She was wealthy, respected, feared. She signed her name Margaret R., as if she were royalty herself. But behind that mask of strength lay the cost of survival. She never had another child. Her body bore permanent damage. And her psyche, shaped by trauma, bent itself around the belief that what had happened to her was somehow God's will. That's the tragedy of Margaret Beaufort. She didn't fight the system that destroyed her, she used it. She became master of the very machine that had broken her childhood, even as she tried and failed to shield others from it. The clearest example came with her granddaughter, Margaret Tudor. Remember how Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York begged Henry VII not to send the young girl into marriage too soon? They lost. History repeated itself. A girl named Margaret, barely into her teens, was sent north to Scotland as a bride, just as her grandmother had been. Think about the weight of that for a moment. Margaret Beaufort had endured the horror firsthand. She had carried the scars all her life. She fought to protect her granddaughter, but she couldn't stop the political tide. It shows us two things. First, that she never forgot. That even 50 years later, the screams of Pembroke were still in her ears. And second, that even she, with all her power, couldn't stop the system. Over the centuries, historians have often softened Margaret's story. They talk about her faith, her intelligence, her political cunning. They mention her fondness for Edmund Tudor, the husband who destroyed her childhood, pointing out that she asked to be buried beside him. But what gets lost is the truth. She was a victim of child sexual abuse. What happened to her was not normal, not acceptable, not excusable by different times. Even in the 15th century, people recognized it as wrong. We need to remember her as she really was, not just the powerful matriarch but the terrified child. Because if we erase the suffering, if we pretend it didn't matter, we become complicit in the same kind of silencing that enabled it in the first place. You might be wondering, why does this story matter now? It happened over 500 years ago. The Tudors are long gone. England is a different world. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Child marriage still exists. In some countries it's legal. In others it happens in secret. And even today young girls are treated as property, married off, traded, sacrificed for profit or power. Margaret's story isn't just history. It's a warning. It's proof of what happens when children aren't protected. When adults decide that ambition matters more than innocence. And that's why we need to tell her story honestly. Not as a sanitized tale of dynastic glory, but as the raw, painful truth of what it cost. Every time you see a portrait of Henry VIII, remember, he existed because a 12-year-old girl was forced into pregnancy. Every time you hear about Elizabeth I's golden reign, remember, her throne was built on the trauma of her grandmother. The Tudor rose, symbol of unity and power, was rooted in blood, in the suffering of a child. That doesn't make Margaret Beaufort any less remarkable for surviving, or for shaping the dynasty her body paid for. But it does mean we need to be honest about what survival really meant. Margaret Beaufort died on June 29, 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday. She had lived through civil wars, dynastic upheaval, the crowning of her son, and the birth of her grandson's reign. She left behind colleges at Cambridge, vast wealth, and a dynasty that changed the course of English history. But when we remember her, we must remember both the woman and the girl. The formidable matriarch who navigated politics like a master, and the 12-year-old child, screaming in agony as her body was torn apart. Because those two figures cannot be separated. The power of the woman was born from the suffering of the girl. So what is Margaret Beaufort's legacy? It isn't just the Tudor dynasty. It isn't just the colleges she founded. It isn't just the political maneuvers that shaped a nation. Her real legacy lies in the truth of her story. In the reminder that behind every dynasty, every throne, every glorious age, there are human costs. And often those costs are borne by the most vulnerable. Margaret couldn't save her granddaughter. She couldn't undo what had been done to her. But maybe we can honor her by refusing to look away. By telling her story fully without sanitizing it. By remembering that she was 12 years old, and that should have been enough to save her. The next time someone romanticizes the Tudors, the feasts, the gowns, the drama at court, remember the truth at the heart of it. The Tudor rose bloomed in blood. It was watered with the tears of a girl who should have been playing with toys, not giving birth to kings. She survived. Yes, she even thrived. But she deserved better. And that's the truth that history too often forgets. Margaret Beaufort wasn't just the mother of the Tudors. She was a survivor of abuse, a child whose suffering was turned into a nation's strength. And until we acknowledge that, until we face the horror at the root of the Tudor story, we risk repeating the same cruelty in different forms. So the next time you see Henry VIII's portrait or hear of Elizabeth's glory, let Margaret's screams echo in your mind. Remember the child who never got to be a child. Remember the woman who carried her scars into history. Because that is the real story of Margaret Beaufort.